I wonder if we could touch for a minute on the, you mentioned it already a little bit, the issue of the stigmata. By the stigmata, we mean the wounds of Christ that Francis received in his own flesh. And I think that was seen in an early Franciscan imagination as the sort of confirmation that he had become almost a living image of Christ.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, 2 years before he dies, Francis, like a lot of guys, has disappointments. The order had kind of gotten large, and everybody wasn't living up to the ideal that he desired. He kind of goes on retreat. It's almost like early retirement. And there was a mountain. I've actually visited this in Italy, Mount Laverna, and it was given for his use by this count, and he goes up there to celebrate this monastic tradition of a fall retreat that begins with the Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross. He takes a couple of his old companions, the guys that had stuck with him, and according to the story, while he is in ecstatic prayer, he has duplicated in his hands and feet inside the wounds of Christ. And we call that the stigmata. And that he didn't make a big fuss about this. In fact, he tried not to, make it widely known, but he's only got 2 years to live. He was in horrible health. He had all kinds of terrible things, which we're not quite sure what he had, but all of the attempted diagnoses sound pretty horrible. Tuberculosis, the bones, and so on and so forth. But they see these wounds at the time of his death. A lot of people, even in the 13th century, didn't believe this, didn't believe that this was possible. Bonaventure preaches sermons later in Paris arguing for the authenticity of this experience, and there were two independent people who saw these wounds, who write about them, etc. This was a revolutionary thing when it became public. Here's a little something you can do. Central Italy, Umbria, Tuscany, etc., full of provincial museums in Pisa and Siena and so on. You can walk into those museums today and look at those great Italo-Byzantine crucifixes that they have. And if there's a strong emphasis on the wounds in the hands and feet of Christ, blood coming down and so on, you can infallibly date those as after 1226, after the canonization of Francis.
Wow.
Well, he said canonized 1228. It had an enormous impact on the imagination of people, and it led to, and this is another kind of insight into Christ, it led into this multiplication of devotional practices oriented towards the suffering of Christ. So you've got devotions honoring the crown of thorns or the wounds of Christ and so on and so forth. Wow. A lot of that flourishes because of the impact of the phenomenon of the stigmata on Francis. Now, the Church has never pronounced that this was something supernatural. Even in the Catholic Encyclopedia, it says that it could have been a real thing caused by intense psychology. No one really knows. But you don't have examples of stigmatics before Francis. Then they become pretty common. Now, I think that the stigmata, of course, Francis had this great devotion to the cross, to the crucified Christ. It's all over his limited writings and all over the things that he says and so on and so forth. But I think that, interestingly enough, you can link his focus on the passion of Christ with his focus on the nativity of Christ, in the sense that both represent kind of self-giving kenosis, if you want to use the line from from Paul in Philippians 2 about this emptying of the self, so that both the nativity, the Eucharist, and the Passion of Christ all are cut from the same notion of God humbling God's self to become man in Christ and offering a model for others to do the same thing.
And so when that offer is taken up and others become a model, if they're a genuine model, we actually see the original presented in a deeper way.
Yes,
than
absolutely,
without it.
yeah.
And in some ways, in St. Francis, maybe this idea of alter Christus meant that even just physically looking at him, his whole being had been transformed by his confirmation, that he even physically was a kind of model.
Right. We're not quite sure what he looked like.
Yeah.
We have a description of him, and this is so typical of medieval writers. We have a description of him in one of the early legends, but that description is lifted word for word out of a description of the life of Bernard of Clairvaux. But
I love the way they do things.
Yes, it's kind of interesting. But we do have a portrait of Francis that was executed in his lifetime or very close to his lifetime. And that, of all things, is in the Benedictine monastery in Nursia, down in the Benedictine place. And there's a fresco of Francis, the thin face with the beard and so on and so forth. But here's the danger of a person like Francis, which he would have abhorred, and that is that you begin to imitate him rather than imitate Christ. He didn't want you imitating him. So, you're not getting any deeper into the Gospels by padding around in sandals today and talking to animals and birds and whatnot, the kind of romantic picture of Francis, because his idea was that he should kind of disappear so that the model could show forth.
There's something even in that self-effacement that renders the model transparent somehow.
Right.
Anyway, thank you so much. Well, it's kind of interesting then, maybe in closing a little bit, if we think about your last comment, that somehow there's something in the configuration of a saint to Christ which, because you're being configured to someone who himself didn't call attention to himself but to the Father, you might say, that there's a kind of self-effacement, I wouldn't say self-erasure, that, I don't know, creates a kind of translucency that a life would be its very own life, as St. Francis was very much his own life, and yet at the same time somehow become, maybe transparent is not the right word, but translucent to the light that comes from Christ. Would that be a good way of putting it?
Yeah, I think so. And if you've run across in your lifetime really holy people, I mean, really holy people, not, Mr. Catholic, who's, running the bingo and whatnot, but I mean, really deeply holy people. There is a transparent goodness about people like that. I mean, they might be elderly or not so handsome or whatever, but it kind of shines forth, and you could ask yourself, well, what's the deep source of that? Well, the deep source of that is their own self-effacement in imitation of the one whom they wish to model, which is Jesus. And I like your point, too, that especially the Jesus of John's Gospel is one who refers everything to the Father. So there's a kind of a self-effacement also in the person of Jesus in the Gospels.
Mm-hmm.